This is John Gilroy from the Federal Tech Podcast.
This is Chris Hurst with OnSolve.
Today, we're going to talk about event management mass notification. Hit the music, Manny.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast, where industry leaders share insights on innovation with a focus on reducing cost and improving security for federal technology. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcast.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast. My name is John Gilroy, and I will be your moderator. Our guest in the virtual studio is Chris Hurst, Vice President for Value Engineering at a company called OnSolve, OnSolve.com. It's so easy peasy, but the origin story for OnSolve isn't easy peasy. And Chris, your origin story isn't either. So both barrels of the shotgun. Hit me. Give me the origin stories, buddy.
All right. Thanks so much, John. Great to be here. Super thrilled to have this conversation. I'm going to go all the way back to September 11th. And what September 11th taught companies was that they needed a way to communicate very, very quickly with all of their employees, whether that's their employees are in the office or traveling around or wherever they're at. They needed phone messages, they needed text messages, they needed emails very, very quickly. And you can think of, not just the major terrorist attacks that drove that need, but natural disasters, shelter in place, all the way into the more recent years of the active shooters. So that is the origin story of OnSolve, starting in the years actually just prior to September 11th, and then really growing in the wake of the terror attacks. Email and phone trees were no longer sufficient. And then over the years, our solutions called Code Red, called SendWord Now, called Mirror 3, OnSolve combined those into sort of a best-in-class mass notification company. And so that's really the story of how do companies and governments mass alert, mass warn lots of employees very, very quickly or targeted very, very quickly. Over time, what the industry has come to realize is that there also needs to be faster alerting, better alerting on the risk side. So how do you know about a breaking event faster? And that's kind of where my story comes in. So it goes all the way back to 2006. From 2006 to 2010, I was working in Iraq and Afghanistan. I was actually a civilian, having left the Army. I'd been an Army diver and worked as an operations officer in CENTCOM, and then spent those years as a civilian leading teams of engineers to work on infrastructure projects. And my teams and my organization needed better breaking data about risk, even though we worked so closely with the Army and the Air Force and host countries. We also need to understand patterns of risk. Is it safe enough to put a team in place? Should we build an airfield? Should we build new water systems and wastewater systems? And so that really got me thinking. I had seen something as an Army officer called Blue Force Tracker. Our listeners who know about BFT will probably agree with me. Awesome in concept. Think of a common operating picture where you can see friendly assets and events and communications, but super clunky. And then that led me to later become a director of enterprise risk management at a large organization called Mercy Corps. And in Mercy Corps, there was a significant, there are many events, but one in particular where Mercy Corps won a large grant with the British government to put in a large water infrastructure improvement project in Goma. We had a team of analysts telling us, hey, it's safe to fly in through Kigali, cross the border. Got the thumbs up all around. I was responsible for risk here, but also just like our clients today, projects across the world in other countries. And so as soon as my engineers flew into Kigali, drove across the border into Goma, they saw all of the news and social media, M23 rebels expected to attack this week. So I get the phone call. It's from John. John says, Chris, what are we doing here? We can't build in the middle of a potential civil war and for sure militia activity. And so that project, that challenge led us to an AAR, an after action review, where we said, look, there needs to be a better way to understand situational awareness faster. We had great analysts. The team was amazing, but they still missed events. And so that led us to start a risk intelligence company that ultimately combined with OnSolve in 2020. So now the critical event management path is understand what's happening, see which assets and people are affected, and then communicate and respond. Does that make sense?
Wow. You just did a 3-hour interview. Yeah, we got to unpack a little of this. Let's slowly unpack this. I mean, wow. Okay. Now, I think many listeners have heard of Code Red. Okay. They know about that, and they know about the alerts, and we see how the alerts have evolved over the years. Now, did you say Kigali in Rwanda? Is that the town you mentioned?
Yeah, so this was after working in Iraq and Afghanistan. I later became a director of risk management at an organization called Mercy Corps. Mercy Corps is a large international NGO, INGO, providing humanitarian assistance, all over the world. And in one story, we, Mercy Corps, were looking to rehabilitate the water infrastructure in Goma, Congo. Goma is a city on Lake Kivu, and the rates of cholera and other waterborne sicknesses are really high. There's a high death rate. It's a brutal situation, and so we, Mercy Corps at the time, had engineers, had amazing partners to come in and rehabilitate that system. But in order to do that, the humanitarian space and our team needs a way to operate safely, right? We weren't coming in with the NGO community typically, and we were similar to that, doesn't come in with armed stuff and weapons, and right, we're trying to fix stuff, fix infrastructure, focus there. And so, every organization that does that kind of work typically either in-house with an in-house security team or hires a team of vendors, analysts to say, look, is this safe or not safe? And we had the latter. We had a team that we had hired, and the team said, yeah, looking at the region, you're good to go, flying through Kigali. Kigali's in Rwanda, and it's where the genocide was in the 90s. But this was, 20 years later, and Kigali's a beautiful city now, and we got the thumbs up. Everything's good to go. And it was really when those engineers crossed into country and they saw local news, local social media saying militia expected to attack. And it struck me as so I get the phone call, we pause the project, we do the analysis, do we pull out, what do we do? Mercy Corps, just to their credit, has incredible, tries to operate in the world's hardest countries. But that experience of not being alerted about this key event, and then trying to figure out what do you do? Where are my people? Where are my travelers? What are my in-country nationals and contractors that we need to warn? What are my responsibilities in terms of duty of care? What do I tell the CEO? Those were big questions. And then how do you message those people? This is not we didn't have a lot of time, right? And so I think that experience encapsulates the what's happening, how does it affect me, who needs to know? And that ultimately was the founding story of a SaaS, software as a service tech company that became OnSolve Risk Intelligence.
I'm trying to stop you here because you're killing me, man. You got to have shorter responses. My daughter's living in Kigali. She was just evacuated from Ethiopia because of a civil war. She had to walk to the airport under gunfire. Now she's living in Kigali. I'm about to order tickets to go there in March. So I get you, buddy. I go Goma. I get it. So and I think at least the people who've been listening to us, who've been in difficult situations, really appreciate your stories. I mean, this is really, you don't know you just don't know. You have no idea what's going on. It might as well be in Venus or Mars or something, because there's no information, and any edge you can have on providing some kind of inkling of what's going on, it puts you miles ahead of everything else. So I think we get it. That's great stories. Now, today, Kigali to the United States. Traditionally, when I think of federal technology and I think of alerts and warnings, I think of data centers. I mean, I live right near Ashburn, Virginia. 70% of the world's internet traffic goes through Ashburn. I think of maybe problems with that. Now that is an expertise that your company has as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's right. So data centers is a great use case. And you think about the risk to every asset maybe being different, right? So with a data center, maybe it's power outages or severe, storms, severe weathers, natural disasters. We're currently in a tropical storm watch, hurricane watch for Norma over in Baja California. So the data center is a great example, but there are many more.
Well, let's talk about the pink elephant in the room. A couple weeks back, there was a small incident in Israel, and people need to know what's going on. And so where do you fit in this picture?
Yeah, we do. And so whether it's the story I talked about earlier with Goma, whether it's a storm or natural disaster anywhere in the world, there is often a signal that there will be a problem. And sometimes those signals come very early. A protest is planned for next week, or a hurricane is expected to hit in 72 hours. Sometimes in the case of Hamas, they take great care not to leave any trace, not to provide any early indicators, or at least to minimize those. And so in our field, the goal is to monitor social media and local news as fast as possible. And we believe that that's a path that's best served with humans and software working together. And then to overlay the client's assets. Here's your travelers in the region. Here's your facilities, your key partners, Haifa Port, Ashdod Port, Ben Gurion Airport, right? And then send targeted alerts to just the people who need to know. And what's interesting about this space, I'll just broaden it for a second. I was working with a client this morning. They have supply chain concerns. That's sort of like a ports and airports, what's going to happen there, and cost of stuff going in the country. They have travelers going into Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And that's what does that individual traveler need to know? They have employees who have families in Gaza. That's a different set of information. And so one of the things that we've seen over the years is that there is no monolith called situational awareness. It is situational awareness for the use case, for the end user who has to make decisions about data centers or travel policies, or I'm on the ground, to your daughter's example right now.
Okay, let's step back here. And we're in Kansas, and we're talking about farming. And I turn to you and go, hey, Big Chris, you going to farm the lower 40? Yeah. And I talk about, alerts. And the farmer would say, well, hey, we have an intelligence community in Washington, D.C. Don't we have smart people there? We have the FBI, we have the CIA, we have these little place called the Pentagon. I mean, so they pretty much do a good, I would think farmer in Kansas would say, Chris, you don't understand. They do a good job, don't they? And then Chris would say,
Chris would say, typically, yes. And also, let's say that's a agricultural association, a group of farmers working together who have to make decisions about what to plant, where to plant, and what to grow. What we see is that even in places like Kansas, tornadoes are on the rise, natural disasters are on the rise. And the U.S. government has a phenomenal service called the National Weather Service, to your credit.
Yeah.
Sometimes that farmer may see the National Weather Service alert because they just happen to see it. But it is rare for farmers, business people, travelers to every day think about, where do I need to go to get the best information that's going to affect me? And so that's our job, right? To bring in tens of thousands of sources, National Weather Service and local social media, local police feeds, to capture both the natural disasters, but also the active shooter that's inevitably going to happen in Kansas. And then to target that just for them.
Yeah. So that's why this technique can be applied to areas like Israel, or areas like where the civil war right now in northern Ethiopia. Bahir Dar, there are farmers there trying to plant millions of trees, and before they can go to a disputed area, they have to know what's going on. So maybe that's where OnSolve would fit in. And so you work hand in hand with intelligence agencies and the federal government to help entities overseas, or is that where you fit in?
Yeah. So let's just talk about government for a second. Think of starting at the city government, and then state government, and then the federal government. Each of those organizations have challenges within that situational awareness to communications path. At the state and local level, it's very common for there to be manual communications between police and between mayors. It's very common for there to be manual communications from the National Weather Service. We have a wonderful, it's a brutal example, but it's a powerful example of OnSolve helping detect a tornado and then get the message out to everyone in Benton County, Tennessee. And the mayor there, you can Google it, Brett Lashley, says it's without a doubt that Code Red helped save lives. Because in many of these instances, seconds really matter, right? You can shelter in place, you can get out of the building, you can tell people avoid the area, right? Security is about time and place. Back to your other example about like Ethiopia, there is also like, what are the patterns? What are the broader, is this generally a good place or not a good place? And that's an area that we've really started investing in over the last couple of years, where take 20,000 incidents every day and now start to analyze where are the patterns suggesting.
20,000 incidents a day, which leads to my next question. In my world of technology, there's something called MFA, multi-factor authentication. Okay, it's good. And there are people who monitor systems, and sometimes they get sick of it and they suffer MFA fatigue. Like, okay, this Chris is, okay, I'm just let Chris in. And Chris is a bad guy. And so how do you separate 20,000 signals? How do you separate the wheat from the chaff? How do you separate the good guys from the malicious actors? So special algorithms, or where does that fit in this discussion?
I'll give you two examples. It's a really, really important concept in security. And just to paint the picture, security is ultimately, as we said, about time and place. So you can think of a fist moving from the air. Is the face in the zone at the time and the place of the fist, right? So how do we think about that? The first is on the information side. You talked a little bit about malicious actors. Our position is that it is very important for your solution, like an OnSolve, to validate the sources. So prior to us ingesting anyone, we go back and look at their history, just like you looked at my history today, and we say, look, is this a good person? Do they say trustworthy things? Or as there's been, if with Israel and multiple times over the last year, there has been a rise with nefarious actors, non-state actors funded by China to try to cause disruption. So we want to look at the history of our sources and make sure that they are trustworthy. And you can think of that almost like a friend. Do you trust this person or not? Then when they say something to you, then you know to believe that. Yeah. The second answer, I'll go quickly, is we don't send 20,000 alerts to every client, right? They have to have an asset in that place or have expressed a need for that topic.
One of my favorite movies is Back to the Future. So I got a Back to the Future question for you here. Actually, it's a little bit variation on the theme. So 15, 20 years ago, risk management involved a lot of financial decisions. It still does today, but now risk management is a topic that's kind of expanding, and now risk management could be a existential threat in a country that people know very little about. I mean, Burundi. People know nothing about Burundi, and so where do you see this technology heading in the future as far as risk analysis and geographic assets, and this whole idea of situation awareness? This is a military phrase that's used. It's used for satellites in space. They have situational awareness specialists for satellites in space now. So where's this future? Where's it heading with situational awareness, with risk management, especially in countries that most people know nothing about?
That's a great point. So just three quick answers. The first is, as you implied, we are now more interconnected than ever, right? So starting in the 1980s, the rise of globalization. What happens in Burundi very likely affects me at the butterfly effect somewhere downstream. And clearly that's happening in Israel and in Ukraine, price of commodities and so on, right? So multiple effects. And we don't see that going away. It's possible it could go away, but we don't see that globalization is going anywhere, right? So that's one. The second, where is this headed, is about the rise of risk. And if you look at the data, as we have, if you look at the number of natural disasters, the last few years of natural disasters, the number of billion-dollar disasters is higher than it's ever been in the last 40 years. You can really see a trend. And so, for me as a young Army dive officer, I used a framework called the probability severity matrix. And that worked well until Indonesia flood, Hurricane Katrina, where those unlikely events became more and more likely. So we are seeing a rise in severe incidents. We're also, and that applies to brazen crime. It applies to, global assumptions about stability are now in question, right? It was common 3 years ago to have software engineers in Ukraine and to believe that Israel would be in a stalemate, and that three big buckets of risk seem to be on the increase: natural disasters, brazen crime, organized retail crime, geopolitical instability. So we got a challenge here, right? And then where does the third topic would be about evolutions in technology. And I'm going to just mention one of them. In 2017, we saw the rise of something called transformers, important part of AI. That was a key pivotal moment, which allowed for innovations like ChatGPT and Google Bard to grow. And that is a superpower in the hands of the good guys and in the hands of the bad guys. Back to your earlier point. So ultimately, the goal, I think, of large language models like ChatGPT, like others in our space, in the risk space, is to better understand, so take lots of information, pull out the key needles faster, and get that to the right person but it's also made harder because now bad guys can use ChatGPT to pollute the information environment, as we saw from China in the aftermath of Maui.
Yeah. There is a gentleman named Nassim Taleb. He wrote a book a while back called The Black Swan. And then he wrote a sequel called Anti-Fragile. So I would see, Chris, someone doing what you do. This should be on your shelf, right, as you go in your bedroom every night. It's right there, and you pull it off, read a couple chapters. I mean, this is what you're dealing with. You're dealing with black swan events. And so how can you be anti-fragile in a black swan event like something that happened in Israel on October 7th? This is a challenge for OnSolve.
It is a challenge. It's a challenge for every business continuity director, every crisis manager, every security team across the world. There's a common phrase now. It's like, there are no more blue sky days. This is the new normal. Do you know what the big event was right prior to Israel for our clients? New York City got flooded.
Pretty minor now. It's not even not even worth talking about.
I was talking to a client, manufacturing client yesterday, where they had a chemical spill that made the news that shut down a plant. And the risk manager was like, "Oh, that's right. That was awful. It was 6 months ago, but they're moving from event to event to event." And we call this, if you look at our website, dynamic risk. It is the rise of events in frequency and in severity. It is the interconnected nature of those events with downstream impacts. Let me just talk quickly about the role of the human in this, the role of our security teams and business continuity teams. If they can use technology to shift some of the monitoring load off, right? Technology to find the key critical information and get that information out, they can spend a little bit more brain bandwidth thinking about, like, how does this affect me in particular? And I think solutions like ours will be more custom over time, but that the imagination in thinking through what could happen and what are the interconnected and being able to map my assets onto that. And then today, we're in Seattle. We're actually running a workshop called a tabletop exercise where we're looking at a big earthquake, the big one on the Seattle fault line. That's why I'm here. So you really want to test that. Internal teams working with, we have private and public sector here at our event today, working. So that's a great practice. Who are your sources? Who are you're going to work with in the case of that catastrophe?
So if you're working for the federal government involved in FEMA, or just about any agency may have some kind of a problem, you can get more information at OnSolve, OnSolve.com. I think there's a blog there. Do you contribute to that blog, Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. So I talked about the dynamic risk blog. Thanks for that. We also have a great new report called the Global Risk Impact Report. And so if you're interested in just understanding the trends that we're seeing at a macro level, whether that's disasters or infrastructure impacts or organized retail crime, it's a great report that your listeners can download.
Right. I'll put it in the show notes page. And the extended title is Physical Threat Landscape. It's like, oh, this is existential. This isn't like theoretically, this is a tabletop exercise. This is, bad things are happening. And I think your experience being at the pointy end of the spear there, it just gives credibility, authenticity to what you say. I mean, when you're in a room up there in Seattle and you're talking about, well, bad things can happen, you say, well, once I was in the former British Congo and this is what happened. And it's going to ring true because anything that happens in rural parts of I believe anything, aliens landing, I believe anything out of Africa because it's so big and there's so much going on. I think it's just like disaster after disaster. It's just after this podcast, we'll exchange stories about disasters in Africa. Too many of those. Well, unfortunately, Chris, I think we're running out of time here. You have been listening to the Federal Tech Podcast with John Gilroy. I'd like to thank my guest, Chris Hurst, Vice President, Value Engineering at OnSolve. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, John.
Thanks for listening to the Federal Tech Podcast. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcast.